And a very good afternoon. This is vk3sl, test missions on 160 metres, and we are back again, back to the workforce, back to the grind. I even was away from home today, but it wasn't a lot to do. It's all in transition. Everyone's up in arms. No one knows what to do, how to conduct things. Round 2 of the Corona missions officially starts today. Never the mind. Well, we'll continue. Doing an afternoon cast is one way to ameliorate the madness. And we have something typical. We're becoming a bit formulaic at this point because I don't want to think too much. But we've got an endless resource here. We've got all these wonderful Prozoot files at our disposal. And tonight we'll have a listen to Henry Hall and his BBC Dance Orchestra, a very, very polished band, outstanding band. And a quick reminder that we're also streaming live. So you can find us on vk3sl as a channel name on YouTube. There's also a secondary streaming service which can be found via my QRZ page if you're a radio amateur, or via a blog spot which we've created for these missions as well. That's again vk3sl.blogspot.com, not at, but .blogspot.com. And there's also an email associated with all of this if you want to drop me a line and say hi and let me know that you're listening or not listening, or you're incensed, or you feel as though I'm treading on your grey line activities. You can send me a note, vk3sl@hotmail.com. So it's at this time for the email. So there we go. Go-to places for these missions if you want to make contact and let me know. Or if you want to refer to it in a more streamlined version, literally. Anyhow, let's have a listen now to Henry Hall and the BBC Dance Orchestra. vk3sl testing.
Every goldenrod seems to nod and nod to the breeze's warm caress. How can you say no when all the world is saying yes? All the stars above tumble into love with the springtime's loveliness. How can you say no when all the world is saying yes? Every jack to his Jill is calling again. Up the hill, down the hill, they're falling again. All the world around is clover bound on the honeymoon express. How can you say no when all the world is saying yes? got me crying again. You've got me sighing again. What is this love all about? I'm in, I'm out. Your kisses right from the start came from your lips, not your heart. You make me happy and then somebody new looks good to you. You've got me crying again, just crying for you. Rolls around again, there'll be flowers on that ground again. Hooray, new day when the morning rolls around. When the sun comes up at dawn again, all my troubles will be gone again. I'll be happy when the morning rolls around. Blues are gone, I'm coming off that shelf. From now on, I'm gonna be myself. When the morning rolls around again, then my happiness is found again. Hooray, new day when the morning rolls around. could supply my sky of blue. After you, who could I love? After you, why should I take the time to try? For who else could qualify after you? Hold my hand and swear you'll never cease to care. For without you there, what could I do? I could search years, but who else could change my tears into laughter after you?
vk3sl.
You and no one else but you. You and no one else will do. Please tell me who put that dimple in your cheek. The kisses you give me last for a week. Your dreamy eyes, your pretty baby smile thrill me through and through. When I feel that love is near, who gives me the right idea? Why, you, just wonderful you.
Tell me about my love, tell me, oh moon, who is she thinking of? Does she belong to me, or is she fancy free while you are gleaming, beaming? Oh, let me know, moon, are we to be apart? Tell me, oh moon, has she another heart? Though it would hurt me so, still I would like to know, oh moon, oh moon.
This is vk3sl. We've been testing on 160 metres in the narrowband FM mode. And you've been listening to BBC Dance Orchestra under the direction of Henry Hall, recordings made in between 1930 and 1932. Very smooth sound, very high production values that ensemble had, and exceptional transfers from Mr. Prozoot. So good material for the missions, and we'll continue now with a documentary on Mr. Korngold. Now, you might recall last night, if you were listening last night, we played the Korngold Violin Concerto. Korngold was one of the great composers, mainly known for his film scores, and he was Viennese born and moved to America when the Nazis came to power and became sort of the golden composer in Hollywood. I found a really good documentary made by the BBC, and it sort of profiles Korngold in relation to the Slatkin brothers. Just to put some context here, the Leonard Slatkin is sort of one. This documentary is also partly about him. He's a well-known conductor today. He's now in his 70s, mid-70s. But his parents, Felix Slatkin, and his mum, Alice Slatkin, were both members of the Hollywood String Quartet. And they were very close to Korngold circles, and they played in the Warner Brothers Orchestra. So this looks at Slatkin's parents and their involvement in the film industry as well. So I'm sort of fast-forwarded a little bit, because I thought that the material about Korngold is probably the most relevant here. So we'll have a listen now to the documentary from about a third of the way in. And you'll hear there's a fair bit about these Slatkin brothers, Leonard Slatkin and his brother Frederick Slotkin, which is the original Russian name. And Slotkin is a cellist, well-known cellist in America, and he, at the end, plays Korngold's cello concerto. But he also refers to his mother, who played it in the great film Deception in the early 1940s. So there's a series of interconnectedness here, but I think you'll pick up the story. It's a remarkable documentary, and it really paints a picture of what an exceptional musician Eric Korngold was. And his status as a child prodigy is something of legend, really. And all of the great composers thought he was the greatest gift, really, since Mozart. He had exceptional gifts as a young person, and then went on to sort of do remarkable things. Great melodist. Is that a word? Doesn't matter. It's about, yes, his ability to craft melodies is the stuff of legends. So yeah, let's have a listen to this documentary on Korngold. I'm vk3sl, and we're testing on 160 metres.
Korngold was born on the 29th of May, 1897 in Brno, but his family moved to Vienna when he was just 2 years old. He was the son of the revered and reviled music critic, Dr. Julius Korngold. By the age of 5, he was able to reproduce on the piano any melody he heard, complete with elaborate chords.
Of all the composers who began as prodigies, composing prodigies, Korngold is perhaps the most extraordinary because he was completely fully formed as a musician from the word go. There was no hesitancy. From his very first published opus, the Piano Trio, he is a fully mature adult composer. To give you an example of this, Mozart, for example, wrote music as a child. People examine it and think how clever he was. But it's not the grown-up Mozart we're hearing. He is still a little child writing clever music. Korngold was writing music of the complexity of Strauss and Mahler. This is what made him special, and which practically turned the world on its ear when he started to perform it in public. Trying to imagine what it was like then in Vienna, this little boy who Mahler proclaimed a genius, who Strauss said he was filled with awe and fear at a child so young being able to write such complex music. So he was a phenomenon, and in many respects there's been no one like him before or since.
I think perhaps most of all for me, just a divine melodic gift. A way of singing a tune through a scene that is inimitable, really. It was a beautiful, beautiful talent, I think.
Hollywood started to take over from Vienna and Berlin as the great melting pot of creativity, with European émigrés transforming it during the 30s and 40s into one of the capitals of world culture.
Korngold's arrival in Hollywood was the beginning of respected composers coming to work in American film.
Korngold actually wasn't trying to get to Hollywood. The only reason that Korngold came to begin with was because Max Reinhardt, the impresario, wanted him to go to do A Midsummer Night's Dream.
Reinhardt had an affinity with Korngold because of their European backgrounds, and he persuaded him to join his team in Hollywood. This film was a huge blockbuster, featuring no less than 20 of Hollywood's greatest stars, including James Cagney, Mickey Rooney, and the very young Olivia de Havilland. And Korngold himself was also considered as having his own starring role in the production.
From Vienna came Erich Wolfgang Korngold to arrange the exquisite Mendelssohn musical score. A brilliant musician, a gifted composer, a man who wrote a complete opera when he was but 11 years of age. Here he is in his study, arranging a beautiful lullaby. Let's listen to it.
That was his first exposure to American film and at Warner Brothers. And he continued over the next couple of years to move back and forth between Vienna and Hollywood, continuing to work and write his operas back home in Austria, but to come back here and work on pictures like Captain Blood, Anthony Adverse. And then in 1938, he did The Adventures of Robin Hood, which is still the classic swashbuckler score.
He actually pulled up the whole idea of film scoring to another level. The only reason he eventually stayed in Hollywood was because the Nazis came into Vienna and confiscated, his home and his possessions and everything else, and the whole family just made it by the skin of their teeth out of the country.
Korngold and his wife Lutzi found that Hollywood offered them the safe haven they were looking for, and they remained there until 1949. Korngold's scores retained the romantic nostalgia of the European music of his youth. Korngold's musical style didn't change all that much during his career. We can hear this in his early incidental music written for Much Ado About Nothing, full of beautiful melodies and simple harmonies, all elaborated with very lush orchestration. It was a long and arduous journey for Europeans coming to Los Angeles. 3,500 miles by ship to get to New York, and another 3,000 miles by train to get here, to Union Station in Los Angeles. They tried to follow their dreams. For many, it was a nightmare. But for those who succeeded, they succeeded fabulously. The way they achieved this success was through the studio system, which also provided a much-needed livelihood for performers, such as my parents. During Hollywood's golden age, there were 11 different studios, and each had its own stable of musicians, writers, and composers. They became a real focal point for international musical talent. I remember a wonderful story I can't remember who told it to me about, it would be, in many cases, a conductor conducting, And while one set of music was being done, on one table, the composer was writing music for the next scene. He would pass the piano or short score down to a table of orchestrators, who would then pass it down to the people copying out the parts, and 2 hours later, they were recording the music.
Literally.
Literally.
It happened a
All the
lot.
time.
Yeah. And while people talk about some of these music departments as factories, in fact, an amazing amount of great musical material came out of this period. And sometimes a score written in as little as 2 or 3 weeks would be a piece that we know and revere and love today.
Did each composer have their own office?
Yes, they did, and it was a major force at the studio because Jack L. Warner loved the music, and we had the Korngolds, the Steiners, the Adolf Deutsches, the Franz Waxmans, and so forth. And they were all under contract.
So it was just like a gigantic, almost musical playground.
Yes,
in a way.
That's right. Over here now, we're going to the scoring stage to our left. It's now called the Eastwood scoring stage.
After Clint.
After Clint. But it is the same, the very same, and it goes way back, into the 30s.
It's where the orchestras were?
This is where the orchestra was, and the recording took place.
Let's go take a look. Please, after you.
Thank you.
My mother over there.
Your mother over there.
Sometimes my dad here.
Okay.
Grandfather maybe there.
And
Uncle over there. Why not have everybody in the orchestra in my family?
I think that it was a mistake.
I think so. All joking aside, the members of my family had a great time recording these glorious scores with Korngold.
He loved working at Warner Brothers, and because he was already a well-known, highly respected composer from the opera and concert world in Europe, basically wrote his own ticket at Warner Brothers. He had his choice of films. I believe his contract stated that he only had to do 2 a year. And he chose which ones he wanted to do, and was treated with the utmost respect. Whereas Max Steiner was cranking out, also at the same studio, 5, 6, 8, 10 pictures a year, Korngold was doing 2 or 3.
They always talk about how hard it is to get into the studio. But going with him, of course, wasn't very difficult. And we'd go through the gate, and he would doff his hat to the man and said, "Oh, good morning, Herr Professor, good morning." And in we'd go, It was such fun. But and everybody, I can't say too much the respect that he had at the studio. It was really quite remarkable. He had his own projectionist and got to knew him so well, and they'd go out sometimes. My husband invitated him so well. He says, "I was one of the boys." He would, you can imagine. I remember how impressed I was by both him and his wife, and I remember thinking, my goodness, my mother-in-law looks so young. But they were so gracious. Everybody always talks about his humor, and which is, he's so quotable and so quick. And then he played the piano, and I was just, I never got over that. And then he had the habit of playing, and then he would go kind of accompany, pum, 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 like that, while he was playing. I really felt as if he were a part of the piano, as if he were in the piano and it was sort of wrapped around him.
Korngold was very, very well remembered in the music community in Hollywood when I arrived there. And I remember older colleagues, particularly the Newman family, Alfred and Lionel Newman, saying that they used to love to go over to Warner Brothers when, as they put it, old man Korngold was conducting. And they would love to go and visit the stage to watch this man who had all those years of theater experience and was, you know, a recognized master, I think, by all of them. He was remembered fondly as a very sweet, lovely man, too, just on a personal level.
Korngold took his theatrical experience and brought it to film in his own particular style.
It's remarkable, really, when you think that he'd never been in a film studio in his life, had no idea how things worked, and yet he just went straight in and adapted himself to the medium instantly. Korngold never used any mechanical aid when he conducted his scores to film. It confused him. His stopwatch was in his head. He had figured out where the music would be in the film, and he had composed it to the running footage. And he wrote just enough music for the scene he was scoring, and then he would conduct it to the picture, hearing the dialogue in one ear through a headphone and the orchestra in the other.
I remember being told that he worked in a little projection room very near the recording stage at Warner Brothers, a little tiny room off the side of where the orchestra would sit. We didn't have tape machines then or anything, so you had to rack up a 35-millimeter piece of film. And he had a little upright piano in that projection room. And he'd work in there all day long with his projectionists to run so many feet, and I guess he would make sketches at the piano.
Is it the nature of the film composer to, by necessity, draw on all inspirations and all sources you can?
Well, I think to a degree we need to make references to time and place in the subject of the piece we're doing. If you're doing a piece about 18th century France, a film that is, you wouldn't want the music to sound like 20th century Rio de Janeiro, for example. You need to make some harmonic adjustments, melodic adjustments, stylistic adaptations, and we do that all the time.
He saw film very idealistically, and he said once, it reaches the great hearts and minds of the people in a way that a concert or an opera never could, because he knew instinctively that it would be seen by millions of people. And he envisaged a time in the future where composers would write operas for the screen. What a wonderful thought.
By late 1937, Korngold had established himself as one of the leading film composers in America. Success led to success, and many more followed, including The Private Lives of Elizabeth and Essex in 1939, King's Row in 1942, and in 1943, The Constant Nymph. These scores also brought their rewards to the orchestral performers, which included my own parents.
I think they were having fun. They were earning money. They were reaching a big audience. They were living now in a new country, a free country, working in a new artistic medium. I think that's joyous, and the atmosphere was more congenial in Hollywood then. It was smaller, less competitive. People were more secure because they had their contracts, so there was less immediate competition for that one job.
As you know, the film industry is extremely lucrative, particularly for the positions that we held, and it would be ridiculous to throw over that and just play string quartets. We couldn't possibly have lived as we did, and we couldn't have indulged ourselves as we did to take trips to play quartets for the enjoyment and not for the money, which is what we were able to do. The film industry was the best place we could do it, and in those days we had in the film industry brilliant composers who wrote many, many solos for all of us, and it was to feed one's ego as well.
One of the highlights of my mother's film music career was her work on Korngold's score for the film Deception, which featured a specially composed cello concerto.
Korngold had been at Warner Brothers for several years, and Deception was going to be what turned out to be his last film for Warner Brothers.
Deception, I think, was a challenge that he couldn't pass up, because it was a picture about a composer and a cellist and a pianist, this love triangle between Claude Rains, Betty Davis, and Paul Henreid.
And it was with Betty Davis that my mother had a particular connection during the making of the film, as she mentioned to Eric Korngold at the time.
I said to Eric, we'll have to record quite soon because I'm pregnant. And with that, Betty Davis said, that's interesting, so am I. And Eric said, well, in that case, I think we'll change the name of the picture to Conception.
This film has so many connections to my family, what with me being in the womb at the time that my mom was doing it. And my grandfather, Gregory Allard, also got involved in the act because in order for Paul Henreid to look like a concert cellist, he really had to study the cello.
So we had on the Deception scoring stage, we had Eleanor Slatkin, who had been Eleanor Aller, doing the cello playing for real versus what was appearing on the screen. And we had Gregory Aller, the father, who had actually coached Paul Henreid so that he could look like he had some knowledge of playing, and they would cut to him for maybe just a couple of bars occasionally on a long shot or a medium shot. And then you had Victor Aller, who was the orchestra manager at Warner Brothers. So it was quite a family affair.
This family tradition continues in another way today. My brother Fred is also a principal cellist with the New York City Ballet Orchestra. And it happens that he plays on the cello that my mother used when she recorded Deception.
One of the first things that I noticed was that the instrument smelled like her. You know, after all, our sense of smell. I said, it reminds me of her. And I cried a little bit. And then I was really just thrilled to death to learn a whole new instrument and have a chance to have something that had been passed down to me.
So to come full circle, I invited Fred to visit the BBC's Maida Vale studios in London to rehearse and record the very same work that our mother performed for Korngold. It had been premiered as a concert piece in 1946 at a live radio broadcast.
The story of the Warner Brothers motion picture Deception revolves around a new cello concerto written by a great composer. Eleanor Aller, first cellist at Warner Brothers Studio, performed the concerto in the filming of Deception, the music for which was written by Eric Korngold.
The Korngold Concerto was written, of course, for the movie Deception. It's chopped up quite a bit because it's so intertwined with the plot. So we hear, you know, large portions of the concerto, but not the whole thing in the movie, even though the final version is only about 13 minutes long.
Now it's 26. In the film, you don't hear this section in the concerto. You hear it as kind of dramatic music leading up to sinister event where someone gets shot. It's the conductor. It's a fantasy. Don't go there. 26. Music films were actually quite popular, weren't they? I mean, biographies of composers. Somehow there was a tradition in it.
That's right, especially in that era where they had just done Rhapsody in Blue, which was the Gershwin biopic, and they'd done others. Deception was, I think, though, unique because it was not a biography of a specific composer, but it took a fictional look at a composer and a soloist and the woman who came between them.
In the film, directed by Irving Rapper, Betty Davis plays a struggling concert pianist who's been set up in grand style by her mentor and lover, the composer-conductor Hallenius. She's torn between this wealthy patron and her former lover, a cellist who returns unexpectedly after the war.
It's true the picture is melodramatic, but I also think that it was a very interesting glimpse inside the music world, which I'm not sure we had really seen before in Hollywood films.
Once Deception went into production, Korngold's role was not simply as composer. He was involved in the dialogue too, which is why many critics believe it is so credible.
The rehearsal scene in the picture was Korngold's invention, because they had a story conference, and it was said, you know, we have to find a way for Rains, the Rains character, to needle the cellist, who was already a bag of nerves because he's been in a concentration camp for 4 years. So how are we going to do this? And Korngold said, well, I can write into the score a repeated mistake.
And what happens is when the entrance comes in, it sounds like it's in the wrong place. So the conductor taps on the podium.
The conductor, who's also the composer, gets on the flute player's case about this, miscounting. Actually, the flute player's right. It's Arthur Gleghorn. Anybody know that name? British flutist who went to Hollywood. Anyway, the conductor gets on his case and goes back and forth.
And he says, no, this is not right, or whatever. And they do it again. And the same place, it falls apart. And then they do it again. And Henri looks over at him and he says, I was under the impression that this was a dress rehearsal and no artist should have to deal with these conditions and whatever. And it's a very hammy and very funny moment in the picture.
Yes, you, sir. Once more, please. The first bar a little faster. I was under the impression I had stopped the orchestra. I was under the impression this was a dress rehearsal.
Not all the original film scores from Hollywood's golden age survive today. But fortunately, Warner's has retained an extensive music archive.
Warner's actually held on to almost all of its music over the years. A lot of studios didn't.
As you can see, there are several hundred very important scores, conductor scores for our very important films.
I could find Deception here?
Yes.
Really?
You certainly can.
Where?
In one fell swoop. Underneath, here is Deception.
Okay. So this is what Korngold would have used?
Yeah, these are the conductor scores at the...
Yeah, they weren't full scores, were they? Just piano versions.
It's more practical for the conductor-composer to use these conductor scores.
And here are the different cues for the film.
That's right. That's the official cue sheet for the film.
So we get the Unfinished Symphony of Schubert.
That's right.
And we get the Haydn Cello Concerto. We get a Bach Adagio. And, of course, we get the music itself.
And here, Leonard, is the Deception Cello Concerto, the full score.
But as used in the film?
Yes, as used in the film.
Wow. So there are things here that are really markedly different.
You said the cadenza?
Well, there's a famous passage. Yeah, here it is. This cadenza here, in the film, actually is impossible to play.
I imposed upon a colleague of mine. I said, listen to this for a second. And we watched the movie and we got to this section. And she immediately went, what? Because you know when you hear that it really can't be done or not very effectively on the cello. And then by the time I listened to it the second time, I realized what was going on. Because the two lines, which are in the interval of minor sixths, are not quite together.
vk3sl.
And they either used two cellists or they overdubbed one to be able to accomplish this little passage right here.
And
it's fascinating.
No, I thought it would, just you handling this would bring back some cherished memories
sure does.
to you for your dear mother, a blessed memory. And she performed, I think, on the original score.
She's the cellist playing in the film.
Although she wasn't seen on screen herself, it was my mother who recorded all the cello music on the soundtrack. But not all of Korngold's score made it to the finished film.
Amongst the scraps of music that I found, there was this thing called the Romance Impromptu. Now, there was a post-it attached to it, which, of course, couldn't be from 1946 because they did not have post-its yet. And it says, written for the film Deception, but unfortunately not used.
So Fred and I decided to play this piece, originally performed by our mother. Most of this film is played as a drama without much underneath.
Really surprisingly little underscore, considering that in that era, a lot of films had 40, 50 minutes of music in it, sometimes more.
We might point out for anybody who does choose to see it, is that the main title music will turn out into the concerto that we're going to hear at the end. And as the film goes along, we hear Hallenius playing bits and pieces of it. So we actually not only see the story evolve, we see the concerto evolve.
And in fact, every time Hallenius goes to the piano and is working on that piece, what we're hearing is actually Korngold playing the piano.
I think any musician who looks at the film would have to agree that it's one of the most remarkable examples of somebody who can't play an instrument but can really look like they do. There's large portions of time where it's very convincing.
So how did they do it? I took some time during a rehearsal break to try myself.
Go ahead. No. I'm not a cellist. So let me invite Fred and Sue in to show you how this is done for film. The first thing you need to know is a special jacket was constructed. And in the back of the jacket, there are two holes where the arms of the two real cellists go. The jacket was placed on Paul Heinried's back. He held the cello this way, gave the bow over, and dropped his arms down. Let me just slide that over. Okay. The other cellist did the fingering. Paul Heinried pretended. And the effect is one that goes like this. Like that. What they actually heard in the studio, especially in the fast passages, wasn't really what was being played. It was just meant to look like what was being played. So often the sound that you heard wasn't going to be the same as would eventually come out in the film. The other thing that would happen, of course, is that the shot of Paul Heinried would come from below, so it really wasn't clear that there were two people behind. And magically, I become a cellist.
A few months after the film, Korngold extended the concerto for concert performance. Fred and I will play it in full with the BBC Symphony Orchestra, 57 years after our mother first recorded it.
This is a test transmission from vk3sl.
After Deception, Korngold returned to Vienna, trying to resume his career as a concert and operatic composer. He didn't succeed. Few people remembered him, so he returned to Los Angeles, where he wrote some of his most enduring masterpieces for the concert hall. He died here in 1957, and he's interred right here, in the very same cemetery where my parents found their final resting place. So our two journeys have been completed. People ask whether Korngold lost his career in Europe or found his real one in Hollywood. Just like my family, it was Hollywood that gave him the widest and perhaps the most enduring audience. But he never lost his European roots. One of his last works, his only symphony, is, to my mind, a direct link to this past. At the end of his life, he felt that Europe had forgotten him. But perhaps it's reassuring to remember that it was Korngold who brought the old world of Vienna to the very heart of the American medium of film.
This is vk3sl. You've been listening to a documentary, a BBC documentary on Eric Korngold, one of the greatest composers of the 20th century. And he was sort of shoehorned into Hollywood and did extraordinary things. And sadly, he didn't manage to reinvent himself in Europe, post-war Europe. But it's a remarkable story, and it's sort of that particular documentary also looks at the Slatkin brothers, what they were doing, and with an oblique nod to the Hollywood String Quartet, two members of the Hollywood String Quartet were the parents of Leonard and Frederick Slatkin. All right, we will continue for a little bit longer because I'm sort of entranced by this whole theme, and I'll look forward and see if we can find the score to The Seahawk. This is one of Korngold's greatest scores, a swashbuckling film from 1940 featuring Errol Flynn. But Korngold wrote the music, and it is epic, to say the least. He wrote a suite which uses the best material from the film, and we'll have a listen to that now for the next few minutes.
This is a test transmission from vk3sl.
Saves me the trouble.
Test transmission, vk3sl.
This is vk3sl. You've been listening to the soundtrack from The Seahawk, a film, a Warner Brothers film from 1940, featuring the music of Eric Wolfgang Korngold. So we've had a feature on Korngold tonight. We played the violin concerto last night, and Seahawk is one of his great compositions, as was Robin Hood. He wrote lots of great music. Deception, we heard excerpts from Deception earlier on, and then we heard the cello concerto, which was a derivation of Deception. So that's our feature for tonight. I think that's it, folks. I think we'll be back tomorrow, all being well, and that's a nice little escapist missions tonight. Good to escape into the ether. All right, until next time, VK3SL testing.
Gott fliegen, wohl die Lille,